the 20th century and beyond both looks back and looks forward at the role of planning in the economies of countries. We examine the history and experiences of planning in India, but in a global context. In the light of this history, it looks forward, trying to evaluate beyond ideologies what role the practice of planning has in contemporary India. It then proposes that the National Institution for Transforming India, the NITI Aayog, the think tank founded on the 1st of January 2015 after the demise of the Planning Commission, could learn from this experience. Starting in 1980, the dominance of neoliberal thinking gave the impression that economic planning as theory and practice was something of the past. The conditions imposed by the World Bank and the IMF resulted in the collapse of planning and planning institutions in many countries. Responding to pressure, the overextended states of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which had overborrowed either domestically or internationally, easily succumbed and reduced the role of state planning in their economies. Then, planning fell completely in disregard with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Indeed, for many observers, this failure of the USSR was, at least partly, supposedly due to planning. How wrong this observation was shown very quickly. Several Western countries continued to plan, notably France. South Africa created a planning commission in 2010. But most importantly, most Southeast Asian and South Asian countries also pursued economic planning. And in India, the Planning Commission devised 12 five-year plans in succession between its creation in 1950 and its folding up in 2014. Remarkably, most South Asian and East and Southeast Asian countries continued to grow in GDP terms between 1980 and 2000, just when in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the post-Soviet republics and Russia, the remaining transition economies of Eastern Europe, with all of them, GDP growth collapsed, per capita incomes fell, and poverty increased when planning ended. Economies have sustained growth, we argue, when they use planning judiciously. Every East Asian miracle economy since 1945 has had an uninterrupted series of five-year plans managed by a planning institution. In China, after the market-oriented reforms began in 1979, the State Planning Commission became more powerful, not less. Similarly, in Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, the successful examples of East Asian development, the state played a crucial role in resolving what institutional economics calls coordination failures by facilitating private sector coordination. This book addresses three leading questions. Why planning for economic development? How to plan? In other words, through which institutional settings? And what exactly can and should be planned? This book is structured in three parts. The first part addresses the history of planning and of the Planning Commission in India. It shows that the replies to our three questions have a history, linked notably with the history of ideas and more precisely with economic history. So while the early part of the book looks back, its later part looks forward to whether India, after the demise of the Planning Commission in 2014 and its replacement by the NITI Aayog, can do without planning. It proposes that the NITI Aayog will need to reinvent itself. First, it needs to reinvent itself, we argue, by supporting cooperative federalism as enjoined by the Indian Constitution, by making grants as the Planning Commission used to do, but now focused on reducing the growing imbalances in development achievement of different states in the Indian Union, over and above the role of the finance commissions. Second, it also needs to reinvent itself to become the source of an industrial policy, in the absence of which India has already allowed manufacturing share in gross domestic product and employment to stagnate. Such a large and complex economy, already since 2014 the world's third largest in purchasing power parity terms, but still a developing country in the middle of its demographic dividend, needs a powerful and domain-competent planning commission, we argue in this book. A planned economic development is not opposed to a market economy. Indeed, most modern economies are mixed economies, incorporating various degrees of the market and of planning. This was true of all the East Asian ones, the miracle economies, as well as European ones that have been used to state intervention from the beginning of capitalism itself, we argue. As Karl Polanyi says, and I quote, while the laissez-faire economy was the product of deliberate state action, subsequent restrictions on laissez-faire started in a spontaneous way. Laissez-faire was planned, planning was not, unquote. From 1950 to 1965, the Planning Commission of India played a critical role in India's industrialization. Then, after an eclipse for over 2 decades in the 1990s, the Planning Commission found a second life as an instrument of social policy. Its role was not industrialization anymore. That was handed over to the private sector, whose share in total investment grew, but filling the infrastructure and social development gap. In this period, it acquired at least as much significance for social development as it had for industry in the first 15 years after independence. So, the focus of a new revamped planning institution for India in the 21st century, we argue, especially after the COVID pandemic, must be, first, filling the social development gaps in India, second, reviving an industrial strategy, and third, in sectors where there are cross-sectoral or cross-state synergies, water, energy, infrastructure, and climate change, it must play a planning role. The book makes theoretical and empirical arguments to show why India still needs planning even more than before. Based on the experience of being former insiders in the Planning Commission, many of us also recommend how the new planning function in India should be structured in terms of human resources for it to execute these functions effectively.